But let's go back to the unipolar moment for a second. What could the U.S. have done differently?
Well, what the United States should have done is it should have not helped China to grow economically. This was a remarkably foolish policy. China is now a peer competitor to the United States, and the United States played a key role in turning China into a peer competitor by fueling its economy. And this strategy, of course, was based on liberal theories of international politics, which I think are wrong-headed. So with regard to China, we should have had a fundamentally different approach. And with regard to Russia and NATO expansion, we should not have pursued NATO expansion at all. But if we did pursue NATO expansion, we should have stopped after the 2004 expansion. When we decided in 2008, when NATO decided in 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO, that was a huge mistake. And the present war in Ukraine is largely a result of that decision. So I would argue with regard to Ukraine and Russia on one hand, and with regard to China on the other hand, we should have pursued a very different policy, and we'd be much better off today as a result.
And you said that even in 2015, I mean, you have a famous public lecture at the University of Chicago online in the internet. I just looked it up. It has 29 million views now. It's entitled "Why Ukraine is the West's Fault." And I mean, that's a quite provocative title, but apparently people like to see it. And I've seen lots of positive and agreeable comments below it. So that's basically, you've been making this argument for a while.
Yeah, well, it was in April 2008 when NATO decided that Georgia and Ukraine would be brought into the alliance. And the Ukraine crisis first broke out on February 22nd, 2014. That's when the crisis broke out. And I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs that attracted a great deal of attention at the time, which said that the crisis in Ukraine, or war in Ukraine, if you wanted to call it that at the time, was largely the West's fault. And of course, people in the West didn't want to hear that, because people in the West want to make the argument that this is all Putin's fault, and it's not the West's fault. But my argument is that it was the West's fault because they pursued NATO expansion for the larger purpose of making Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. Russia said this was unacceptable. But anyway, I wrote that article in 2014, and then I was asked to give a talk to the University of Chicago alumni in 2015, a year later. And I chose that as a topic, and I gave this talk. To be honest, Max, I don't even remember giving the talk. I have no recollection of giving the talk.
That's amazing for something that had such an impact.
It's had such an impact. 29 million views.
But
it's
maybe
astonishing.
Because it just came natural to you and you just were expressing your natural thoughts. This is so clear to you that you didn't have to think about it a lot because it's just so clear before your eyes that you forgot all about it, and then it went stratospheric.
Yeah, well, I think once the war broke out in 2022, the present war broke out, I think people then were deeply interested in finding out what caused it. And I offered an alternative view to the mainstream. And I was one of the few people who offered that alternative view. So I think in that context, it's unsurprising that lots of people viewed this 2015 video and produced 29 million views.